Asako, hey, congratulations on being part of the series Eyes on of the Prize on the Prize 3.
Thank you.
And more congratulations is it's a very important episode with What Comes After Hope. Could you tell us how did you come on board to this project?
Well, I initially was asked by Don Porter to come on as just the series producer. Um, and I felt like I wasn't worthy of the legacy because Eyes on the Prize is so iconic. And even though I knew a lot about the history and I had done a lot of other programs about and films about race and equality and social justice, I still felt like, wow, I mean, that's the gold standard, Eyes on the Prize. But then, she didn't give up, and I came on, and then I ended up also directing one of the episodes, and it was amazing. There was such great directors. Some of them I was already, knew well and was friends with and had worked with before. Others who I met for the first time, that I only knew their work, and so it was a really great collaboration between all of the directors and Dawn, which I really was so glad to be part of.
Now, I wasn't sure when in a series like this, do you have a choice of which projects that you get to do? And so did you just land on between 2008 and 2015 or is that a choice of yours?
The process of choosing the stories was extremely involved because we all knew we wanted to, once we had all agreed to do it, we all came together, and it was still 2021, it was still the pandemic, so we had to do all the COVID tests and get together in a room together, and we watched the original series and we talked about, what are we going to do, like, are we going to just continue as they did? That wasn't even clear at the beginning. Were we going to each do our own themes? So we talked about what we each were passionate about and wanted to see be in the series, but also things that we thought were important in the years since that, the previous two. There was
Mhm.
also a moment where we even thought, we saw how the previous series, Eyes on the Prize 2, had ended, and it ends in the 80s at a time where clearly the filmmakers and audiences didn't understand what the impact of the Reagan policies would be. Things that we really feel, even, I would say, the result of today. So we thought, let's roll back a little bit. Let's overlap a little bit with the last series, because now we have a different understanding of what happened during the Ronald Reagan presidency. And let's take a similar approach. We all knew we wanted to keep the approach of shining the light on ordinary people who became activists and ordinary people who made change wherever they were. And really, depending on what each person wanted to do, we would end up getting, it sort of all naturally worked out that we chose subjects that we really cared about.
So in the case for yourself, because it's a between 2008 to 2015, which is the Obama years, um, because the fact that it's more recent than the other, what the other decades or the other projects that the other directors actually have, was this much easier for you? Because technically, I want to say it's kind of fresh on our minds, and a lot of people are somewhat familiar with these movements.
Well, in a way, yes, but I feel there was a lot of misunderstanding. Certainly, when this was, when we were figuring it out in 2021, I feel like there had been a lot of misinformation and the beginning of some pretty serious demonization of what was being called the Black Lives Matter movement. And yet, at the same time, there was also a kind of fatigue of hearing about Trayvon Martin and, you know, Mike Brown and George Floyd, and they felt like they knew the story. And so, in a way,
Mhm.
that was a different challenge. So, even though I could draw upon people's emotional reaction to watching, Obama's first inauguration, or, those more recent memories, there was also a kind of fixed narrative about that. And so, what was important to me was I wanted to really challenge that narrative and say, well, what really happened? This idea that everyone had, that we were, once America had elected a black president, we were going to have a post-racial society. That actually didn't come about. And it was the young people who saw how that was not really the reality that they were living. And that was a really interesting process because they also were very, the Dream Defenders and the Black Youth Project 100, who I featured in my film, they were very aware that they were not the only ones. They weren't trying to say we were the beginners of this or that, we created this or that. They said it was a movement building moment, and that all of these young people, who many of whom hadn't been old enough to vote for Obama the first time, they saw the joy and hope of their parents, and they felt it too. But then they also saw the reality around them, and they said, kids like me that look like me are being shot by police or by white vigilantes, and it's not okay. My parents have lost their home in the 2008 financial crisis. I can't pay my student loans. And this was the kind of, revisiting of that era, which felt so hopeful at the time, but which they could see that it wasn't actually equality that they hoped for. There was a symbolic victory of the election of a black president that was so important, but they could see that there were still problems, that racism hadn't ended, despite what the media wanted to say. And so I think it was, for me, really a challenge, both of the sort of challenging the familiar narrative that had been created, and yeah, it was certainly, not only was it easy to rely on people's recent memories, but there was also a lot of archival footage. Everyone had phones, just
Yeah.
that right there. The fact that so many people were like, oh, I actually took some videos on my phone of that protest. I mean, compared to episode 1, where they were, having to go look for archival materials that were not necessarily easy to find. So I did have that advantage. Was certainly the availability of camera phones made a big difference.
Now, the community leaders that you presented them, they're there's a lot of them. And I don't want to say it's like too long ago, but you're talking about 10 years ago. Tell us about tracking them down and convincing them to be a part of your documentary episode.
Well, there were definitely people who had been in either of those organizations who didn't want to participate, and that was okay. I mean, I understood that. Not everyone wants to be in a documentary. And then there were people who were happy to have their story be told because they were so well versed in the history of the civil rights movement, and they knew that their experience would be valuable to those who came later. And I thought that was really interesting, because just in the same way that they invited Harry Belafonte or Julian Bond to come to the Florida State House when they were there, they thought, okay, this is history. We are part of this history. We're part of this, long struggle. So those who come after us will also want to know how we did it. And so those who wanted to participate, that was, a lot of them had that sense of history. And then those who didn't, they were tired out by some of this stuff, or they had moved on, or they're in graduate school, or they have kids. And so, I respected their choices, but I feel like in the end, a lot of them were really generous with their time and let us in to tell their stories, which, I'm so grateful for.
In the end, did you get a sense that they're still hopeful, despite not achieving certain type of goals? I'm pretty certain some of them are kind of disillusioned of what's happening now, than then.
It was interesting because my episode showed in the Doc NYC Festival. And so some of them came, a bunch of them came, about 7 people from my episode came to the screening. And I brought them all out for the Q&A. And it was a real interesting thing, because since the time that had passed, and, we certainly didn't expect to be, reeling from the results of the November election, and, not which none of us, I think, had fully believed would happen. There were some who expressed, a kind of despair, and then there were others who had incredible energy and hope. I mean, they ended up singing songs and like came back to the second screening with the guitar and sang even more songs. So I would say that it's, knowing the history is valuable because even though it's extremely daunting right now, the sense that, I mean, how daunting was it in the 50s, when you
Mhm.
couldn't even have a seat on the bus or, they were going to sick dogs on children. So there is a kind of courage that comes from caring about freedom and caring about your community and being willing to risk something for that. And I think that still carries on.
Excellent. Asako, let me wrap it up with one last question. As people have a chance to watch Eyes on the Prize 3, especially your episode, What Comes After Hope, what is the one most important take you hope they walk away with?
I hope they understand that even though it's scary and it can feel like it's not enough, it's always worthwhile to resist and to fight for your principles and to fight for the freedom of yourself and others. I think it's always worth it.
Well said. Asako, thank you very much for speaking to us. It's a great documentary series, and you had a terrific episode. So thank you for this
Thank you
conversation.
so much.
Thank you. Bye now.